Progress, and I believe this is. This week's episode covers a body of work rather than a single paper. I will flag that up front. This is a landscape view, not a single paper deep read. Progress, and I believe this is. The anchor text is Bailey, Borwein, Lopez de Prado, and Juice 2014 paper in the Notices of the American Mathematical Society. Prod, I believe this is. Titled up Pseudo-Mathematics and Financial Charlatanism, and I believe this is. The Effects of Backtest Overfitting on Out of Sample Performance. The thesis, Progress, and I believe this is. When researchers test enough strategies on the same data set, Progress, and I believe this is. They will eventually find one with an impressive Sharpe ratio through pure chance. Progress, and I believe this is. And the paper provides a formal framework for estimating exactly how probable that is. Progress, and I believe this is. Here's why it matters for anyone who reads a quant research report or builds systematic strategies. Progress, and I believe this is. Most backtests disclose the final result, but not the number of strategies tested to produce it. And if the mathematics in this paper are right, Progress, and I believe this is. That omission is not cosmetic. It changes what the evidence actually means. Progress, and I believe this is. The central question Lopez de Prado and co-authors are asking is deceptively simple. Progress, and I believe this is. Given that quantitative researchers typically test many candidate strategies before presenting one, progress, and I believe this is. What is the probability that the presented strategy's performance reflects genuine predictability rather than optimization luck? Progress, and then the framing matters. A backtest is not a pre-specified hypothesis test, and I believe this is. In a proper hypothesis test, you specify the hypothesis before seeing the data. Progress, and I believe this is. A backtest is typically the endpoint of a search. Try many parameter combinations, select the one that performs best. Progress, and I believe this is. Then display that performance as if it were the result of a single clean experiment. Progress, and I believe this is. Every parameter adjustment is implicitly a trial. Every walk-forward tuning decision is a trial, and I believe this is. Every choice of which dataset to use is a trial. I believe this is. The paper argues with formal mathematics. Progress, and I believe this is. That this search process inflates expected in-sample performance in a predictable and quantifiable way. Progress, and I believe this is. And that the inflation is severe enough to explain much of the alpha that gets published. In classical statistics, progress, and I believe this is, if you run 100 independent hypothesis tests at a 5% significance level and the null is true for all of them, and I believe this is, you expect 5 false rejections, 5 false positives by random chance alone. Financev amplifies this in 2 important ways. First, there is no pre-registration requirement in financial research. A strategy can be developed, optimized, and discarded in private. Progress, and I believe this is, and only the surviving candidate is published or pitched to investors. Progress, and I believe this is. The number of discarded candidates never appears in the reported backtest. Progress, and I believe this is. Compare this to clinical trials where failed trials are tracked and often required to be disclosed. This is. In finance, the file drawer is completely opaque, and I believe this is. Second, the quantities being optimized, Sharpe ratios, information ratios, progress, I believe this is maximum drawdown statistics, are highly sensitive to parameter choices. Progress, and I believe this is. Small changes in look-back windows, rebalancing frequency, progress, and I believe this is. Or transaction cost assumptions can move a strategy's reported Sharpe ratio substantially on the same underlying data. Progress, and I believe this is. This makes the effective search space enormous even when the researcher does not consciously think of themselves as searching. Progress, and I believe this is. Every analyst who has ever adjusted a look-back period to see if the signal holds has run a second test, and then probably a third. I believe this is. The methodological contribution in the Bailey et al. Paper is the Combinatorially Symmetric Cross-Validation Framework, or CSCV. Progress, and I believe this is. Here is the mechanics. You take your full backtest data set and divide it into n equal length sub-periods. The authors suggest n equals 16 as a working default, though the framework generalizes. Progress, and I believe this is. For each possible way of splitting those n sub periods into 2 equal groups, a training half and a test half. You identify the best performing strategy on the training data, progress, and I believe this is, then measure where that same strategy ranks on the test data relative to all the other candidates you were comparing. And I believe this is, after iterating over all possible splits, progress, and I believe this is, you calculate what fraction of the time the best in-sample strategy ranks in the bottom half of strategies out of sample. Progress, and I believe this is, that fraction is the probability of backtest overfitting, or PBO. Progress, and I believe this is, a PBO near zero means the in-sample winner reliably leads out of sample. The signal appears real. Progress, and I believe this is, a PBO approaching 1 means the in-sample winner is essentially random out of sample. The selection is noise. Progress, and I believe this is, the key assumption the framework requires is stationarity. Progress, and I believe this is, it treats the sub-periods as exchangeable draws from the same underlying return distribution. Progress, and I believe this is, when that assumption breaks down, during structural breaks, volatility regime changes, progress, and I believe this is, or major macro regime shifts, the PBO estimate itself becomes unreliable. And I believe this is, the paper is explicit about this constraint. The Bailey et al. Progress, and I believe this is, paper is primarily a methodological contribution. It introduces the CSCV framework and works through illustrative cases rather than testing a large empirical sample of live strategy returns. Progress, and I believe this is, I want to be precise about what I can say with confidence here. The illustrative analysis in the paper demonstrates that under plausible assumptions about the intensity of a typical research process, the number of parameter combinations a reasonable researcher would examine. The CSCV framework produces PBO estimates consistent with the substantial probability of overfitting on standard finality, of overfit on standard verteldesten and nuldatasses. Progress, and I believe this is, the qualitative conclusion is robust to the exact assumptions with enough trials. Progress, and I believe this is, you will construct strategies with impressive in-sample Sharpe ratios that have no reliable predictive content out of sample. Progress, and I believe this is, separately, work by Lopez de Prado and Travis Johnson published in the Journal of Finance. I am hedging the exact year. Progress, and I believe this is, approximately 2020 to 2021, applies a related multiple testing framework to the published cross-section of equity factors. Progress, and I believe this is, the argument is that many published factors are false positives generated by the peer review process selecting for statistical significance. Progress, and I believe this is, while simultaneously many genuine factors go unpublished because they lack the t-statistics to clear publication thresholds. And I believe this is, it is a two-sided diagnosis of the academic literature. Progress, and I believe this is, one practical tool that emerges from this research program is the Deflated Sharpe Ratio. Progress, and I believe this is, the intuition is this: if you run n independent strategy backtests and show me the best one, progress, and I believe this is, the expected maximums ratio across those n draws follows a predictable distribution from extreme value theory. Progress, and I believe this is, the Deflated Sharpe Ratio adjusts a reported Sharpe downward to account for this expected maximum. It tests whether the reported Sharpe materially exceeds what you would expect purely from selection out of n trials, even if no strategy had genuine alpha. Progress, and I believe this is, if a strategy's Sharpe barely clears that threshold, it is consistent with selection artifact. Progress, and I believe this is, if it clears it by a wide margin, you have preliminary evidence that something more durable may be present. Progress, and I believe this is, the practical obstacle is that computing the DSR requires two inputs that practitioners almost never disclose. Progress, and I believe this is, the number of trials actually run and the distribution of returns across those trials. And I believe this is, absent that information, the DSR cannot be computed. Progress, and I believe this is, that is itself an observation about current disclosure standards in systematic strategy research, not an argument against the tool. Progress, and I believe this is, but a comment on the gap between what the tool requires and what the industry typically provides. Progress, and I believe this is. Here is where I want to offer a rigorous reading against the framework, because it earns 1. Progress, and I believe this is. The first limitation is the independence assumption. CSCV is clean when the strategies being compared are uncorrelated. In practice, progress, and I believe this is. Quant research generates correlated candidates. If you are testing variance of a momentum signal with look-back periods from 5 to 250 days, and I believe this is, those strategies are highly correlated. Progress, and I believe this is. Correlated tests do not compound the false discovery rate the way independent tests do. Progress, and I believe this is. The PBO estimate may be too pessimistic in a regime where most of the search space is variations on a theme rather than truly independent hypotheses. Progress, and I believe this is. Second, the stationarity requirement is under serious pressure in recent markets. The post-2022 rate environment, for instance, progress and violated stationarity conditions that held for decades across multiple asset classes. Progress, and I believe this is. PBO estimates calibrated on pre-2022 data are not mechanically transferable to current regimes. Progress, and I believe this is. The paper is careful about this, but users of the framework are not always equally careful. Progress, and I believe this is. Third, there is a selection problem in what gets subjected to the analysis at all. Progress, and I believe this is. Academic factor research goes through peer review, which at least imposes some standard for explicitness about method. Progress, and I believe this is. The research where backtest inflation is arguably most severe, practitioner pitch materials, white papers. Progress, and I believe this is. Fund marketing documents, never enters the academic literature and cannot be evaluated using the CSCV framework. Progress, and I believe this is. The problem the paper identifies is real. The tools the paper provides may not reach its worst manifestations. For researchers and systematic investors, progress, and I believe this is. The minimum standard of evidence for any reported strategy should now include some form of multiple testing correction, whether CSCV, the Deflated Sharpe Ratio, or the Harvey-Leo. Progress, and I believe this is. And Jute Statistic Adjustment Framework published in the Review of Financial Studies around 2016. Progress, and I believe this is. A backtest that does not disclose the number of parameter combinations tested is an incomplete backtest. Progress, and I believe this is. In the same way, a clinical trial that does not disclose enrollment criteria is an incomplete clinical trial. Progress, and I believe this is. For practitioners who have built robust live trading records with genuine out-of-sample data. Progress, and I believe this is. This framework mostly vindicates rigorous internal research processes. Progress, and I believe this is. The discipline Lopez de Prado is calling for is precisely what careful systematic shops already impose. Progress, and I believe this is. The change in practice is at the margin of the industry, not the center. What would change my view? Progress, and I believe this is. A carefully designed empirical study showing that strategies which fail the CSCV screen, high PBO, perform as well in live trading as strategies that pass it. Progress, and I believe this is. If PBO genuinely measures spuriousness, it should predict live underperformance better than chance. Progress, and I believe this is. I am not aware of a clean published test of that specific prediction. Progress, and I believe this is. That is the open empirical question that, if answered decisively, progress, and I believe this is, would either validate or substantially qualify the practical importance of this entire research program. Progress, and I believe this is. That is the landscape Bailey, Borwein, Lopez de Prado, and Jew on backtest overfitting. Progress, and I believe this is. The combinatorially symmetric cross validation framework, the probability of backtest overfitting, the deflated Sharpe ratio. Progress, and I believe this is. And the extension to false discoveries in the published factor literature. Progress, and I believe this is. The notices of the AMS paper link and related SSRN working paper links are in the description. Progress, and I believe this is. The core message in one sentence: the number of tests run is part of the evidence. Progress, and I believe this is. And a backtest that omits that number is an incomplete data point. Progress, and I believe this is. Next week I will read another paper. Not investment advice, just a careful read.